marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live, this is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. It is the Wednesday edition of Point of View, and we are privileged to have in studio with us today our good friend, Dr. Paul Barreca, and we're going to be talking about a number of different things, not only his recent mission trips. We're going to talk about our trip to Greece. We haven't spent much time talking about that, but he is, of course, one of the teachers. We'll get into that. Also, he's in town not only because of missions, because he was at Dallas Theological Seminary today, but, of course, he's also been in town because of the pre-trib study group, so we'll get into prophecy. So there are a lot of topics we're going to address over the next hour. And of course, if you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. Dr. Paul Barreca is the executive director of Fellowship International. He's pastored 4 different churches in Pennsylvania, Michigan, and New Jersey. Might come back to that a little bit later. We've talked about his book, Follow the Master, and also a discipleship course. But most importantly, he is a good friend and an individual. We've done trips to both Israel, Greece, and Rome. And here we are once again, face to face.
Great to be with you and your audience today, Kerby, and just want to wish everyone a happy Christmas season. I know that's coming up sooner than we think.
I think so. Well, let's talk about, first of all, you've been in India, you've been in Nepal, you've been speaking at a place I had a chance to speak occasionally, Word of Life in Hungary, but in some respects, you've been traveling. Then we had this election, I'm sure you heard about it, and your argument is that has changed a little bit, and one of those is we're starting to see even more intense persecution of Christians, and we've had some of the people from Open Doors and Voice of the Martyrs on this program, but speak to that because you are well aware of what is happening right now in some of these countries around the world.
So I do believe there are implications of the election, of course, in every phase of life, but particularly in my area, which is as a missionary director. We met with our missionaries on our monthly online meeting. It's the first Wednesday of every month, so it was November 6th, right after the election. And I was able to share with our missionaries that we see 3 pretty big implications of a new Trump administration. One of them is dealing with the area of persecuted Christians. And the persecuted believers around the world have really had very little attention from either the media or the Biden administration. In fact, right now in Nigeria, I'm not sure, we've talked about it before here on Point of View, but what's going on in Nigeria is really very severe. Open Doors Nigeria says that more believers are killed for their faith in Nigeria every year than everywhere else on the planet. And it's just this incredible persecution. There are estimates that 350,000 people, Christians in Nigeria, have been killed since 2009. And that's a variety of groups. It's Boko Haram, it's the Fulani. And I'm just pleased that there will be an advocate. As you well know, one of the things that Biden did early in his term was to take the Nigeria off the terrorist watch list, and that had a huge implication. It kind of gives those who are doing those things more of a green light. So one of the implications for missions is a better advocacy and justice for persecuted Christians.
One of the other ones you talk about, it was interesting enough, we had an expert in here who's actually going all the way back to have worked with Brother Andrew, in which, as he was talking about persecuted Christians, he said, I'm also looking at what is happening here in the United States, but it does seem that maybe less interference of Christian universities, churches, even Christian schools, this incoming administration seems to be much more, and has been in the past, much more sympathetic to Christian schools schools, and yet you look at some of the commentaries I've put out about some of the various fines that have been brought against Grand Canyon College, Liberty University, some of the attempts to try to force woke theology on various Christian schools. I think a lot of that is coming to an end as well, don't you think?
Praise the Lord for that. Yes. In fact, one study shows that 70% of the Biden administration's education enforcement was targeted at Christian colleges and universities. And what's really shocking about that is that they only comprise less than 20% of the universities. Now, I think that's pretty clear that there is an intentional bias. And many universities, in fact, FIM, we go to Christian universities. We go to Liberty and Cedarville and a number of other Christian schools, more East Coast, but Grand Canyon as well. And these schools, particularly the larger ones, have been a focal point for the Biden Justice Department in a very, very unfair way. I mean, really nitpicky things that other schools had done, and just finding a way of harassing Christian universities. So that has an implication for missions as well, because as you know, our missionaries, they're going to be at a Christian school, and the Lord has seen fit to give us a more sympathetic administration moving forward.
I might just mention one other one, and that has to do with a better economy, maybe more giving to churches. We had Jack Graham, who you know only so well. Pastor Jack Graham was sitting in that chair just about a week ago, and we still have available on our website a video. Go to our video section. Dr. Jack Graham talks about the Jesus Book, and one of the things we talked about, and as a matter of fact, I have a commentary coming out, the number of sales for Bibles is up 22%, and it seems to indicate that maybe even giving to churches and Christian organizations and Christian missions may be up as well. We'll see how that happens between now and December 31st.
Well, we see, I'm sure you see it here at Point of View as well, Christian ministries depend on the generosity of our listeners, of our patrons. Of course, we want folks to be faithful to their local church. And above and beyond that, many find giving to organizations such as Point of View and Fellowship International Mission and many others. But with a better economy, I think that's a part of it too. The stock market seemed to, skyrocket right after Trump's election win in November. And so the better economy has a pretty big implication for Christian ministries. The U.S. is still the largest financial support for missions around the world. And that's one way that our Christian community can be involved, is to recognize that there are missionaries who are dependent on support, as well as Christian ministries and radio programs. And, I was just thinking about one other thing, Kirby. We saw the power of a new media, such as podcasts and so on. But Point of View has been doing this for a lot longer than Joe Rogan, and the impact of that in just the American culture is huge. And just so thankful to be sharing that with your audience today.
Point of View was, I guess, now up to 52 years, and before there was Jim Dobson on radio, before there was a Rush Limbaugh on radio, before there was Joe Rogan on podcast, there was a Point of View, and so that is the case. He did mention giving, and I'll just mention we do have a banner up now, Give the Gift of Truth. We have a matching challenge up to $120,000. So
Amen.
If you want to be part of that at any time, I know some of you are going to wait maybe to the last week. Point of View people always wait to the last week. That is the case. Hope you aren't waiting too much longer, because after the break, we're going to be talking about this trip to Greece. It is almost filled, but we wanted to talk about it again because there's still room for you, and we're going to spend some time talking about that. And then, since I got a prophecy expert sitting across from me, a lot of you, especially that are with Bible Study Fellowship, have been making your way through the book of Revelation. How do we think about that? And are there some things that have surfaced even in some of the research that some of these individuals have done? We're going to share with you some of the cutting edge material about prophecy, because there are a lot of people been looking at those issues for a millennia, but in some respects we now know maybe more than we know even in the past. So we're going to talk about all of those issues. We come back though, we're going to talk about our trip to Greece before we get into biblical prophecy, because we are privileged to have with us today in studio Dr. Paul Barreca. We'll take a break, be back with more right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Yesterday, I talked about some of the tests Glenn Beck proposes in his new book, Propaganda Wars. The first three are the liar-liar test, the what is a woman test, and the egg-throwing gorilla test. If you don't know what those are, you might consult the transcript for yesterday's commentary. His fourth test is the bias test. People and institutions are more likely to cite facts that support their ideological or religious views. If a secular liberal news source reports something favorable to conservatives or Christians, it is likely to be true. The fifth test he calls the bloodthirsty tyrant test. If someone supports or calls for violence, you should not trust that information. The mainstream media has frequently downplayed the violence and threats from Antifa. He argues that if you think your cause is so righteous that it justifies burning cities down, then you shouldn't trust that source. Another test is the original source test. This test is more difficult because you shouldn't always take at face value a statement that isn't a first-hand account. It takes time and patience to find the original source. Glenn Beck devotes a few pages to show how the false story of 500 people who died in a hospital in Gaza was repeated verbatim by multiple outlets. A final test is the crazy uncle test. Along with Christmas carols and Thanksgiving turkeys, one American holiday tradition is getting trapped by a completely absurd conversation with a crazy uncle. Glenn Beck suggests we treat the entire social media industry as though it is a crazy uncle. You will need wisdom and a degree of skepticism to navigate the propaganda wars in the 21st century. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kerby's booklet, A Biblical View on Loneliness, go to viewpoints.info/loneliness. That's viewpoints.info/loneliness. You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Great privilege to have in studio with us today Dr. Paul Barreca. If you'd like to know more about Fellowship International Mission, you can go and click on the button there that says See More right next to his picture, and then scroll down, and that will take you to FIM.org. And so that's one. But underneath it is also one that says Trip to Greece with Aegean Sea Cruise, and that is something we've mentioned. But I thought maybe even by the time you were scheduled to be here in December, we might say, well, it's all full. But fortunately, it's not. So if there's some people that have been saying, well, I'm not going to make a decision till the end of the year, not going to make a decision till after the election, we do have this incredible opportunity to be in Greece, then have a cruise through the Mediterranean, and we get to go to all these key sites. We call this, again, the Journeys of Paul and John, and you and I are both the host along with our wives. And so tell us a little bit more about this Greece trip. This, I think, is going to be very exciting.
It is going to be amazing, and it will be the second time we've taken Point of View listeners to Greece. The first time was after our Israel tour, and we had a much shorter time in Greece. And we also we're going to be doing something very, very unique. We're starting in the north of Greece in Thessaloniki, the modern name, but of course, biblically, that would be Thessalonica. And there are ruins that go back over 2,000 years that we'll be visiting. And that's the way that Paul would have come down from the north of Greece. Of course, if you think of the second missionary journey and the Macedonian call, well, Macedonia is Greece. And so Paul goes from Troas over to Greece and travels and goes to Thessalonica, Berea first, and that we're going to follow those paths. And so at these places, for those of the listeners that haven't been on one of these tours, either an Israel tour at every one of these sites, either you or myself, we're going to open the Bible and talk about Paul. And it is just amazing to be on the place where Paul was and reading these stories and even traveling. I mean, we're going to be taking a bus ride, down through the same path, generally speaking, of the way that Paul would have gone from Thessalonica and Berea and then down, of course, to Athens and Corinth, all on his second missionary journey, tracing those steps as well.
One of the things I like about this is that when you go to Israel and you're in the Galilee and you can go to Capernaum, you can kind of get a sense of what that was like. When you go to Jerusalem, you say, now down there is where the pool of Bethesda is, and you don't get the same feeling. But when you go to Greece, when you go to Philippi, it's still pretty much like it was. You can actually go and see where most likely the first person baptized was. When you go to Corinth, you can again see what Corinth looked like. And matter of fact, one of the pictures here is you and I are standing in front of the Bema seat, and you can go to Athens and you can say, well, that's Mars Hill. And so there's just a lot more that you can see. Then, of course, we get on a boat and we go to Ephesus, and that looks just again like it was when Paul was there pretty much. We go to Patmos, get a sense of what it was like during John having the revelation. And then we also go to Crete and Santorini and Mykonos, a couple of fun things there as well. But this is something we've always wanted to do, and it actually goes from May 17th to the 27th, so we can do it a little more leisurely, but at the same time really get a sense of what was happening when Paul is bringing the gospel to Europe.
And there's a great balance of course, archaeology, biblical archaeology, but we've squeezed in some fun things in there as well. I think everybody that goes to Greece wants to see Santorini and some of these other places. But the combination of first focusing on the ministry of Paul and ending up, of course, in Ephesus, and that part will be, of course, Paul would have been in Ephesus before he would have been in the Macedonian cities, but then focusing on John and thinking about Ephesus. And of course, John had a ministry. He was the pastor of Ephesus at the church at Ephesus. And then, of course, exiled to Patmos, which we will visit as well. So an amazing balance of Bible teaching, and one of the wonderful things, and we've enjoyed it, we have lifelong friends that we met on these tours.
Yes.
As well as the group itself. When you travel together, it just brings such a wonderful spirit. A lot of times we're singing on the bus or hearing, other testimonies and stories and Bible content, and to be together with a group of Christians with a biblical focus is really a great blessing.
Well, and again, there are very sociable people, including your wife, Kim, and my wife, Suzanne. So they're out there meeting people and interacting with people. And lots of times when I look down our Christmas card list, I say, a lot of those came from various trips that we've taken over the years. And as a matter of fact, right now, one of the groups that went to Israel with us, they've actually had a Zoom call every month. This is a relationship that continues much more. But let's give some people the details because, again, if you are interested in this or know somebody that is, and then we're going to move on to some other topics, we have a brochure. I'll hold it up here, and you can ask for it, but we have a link to give it to you as a PDF. So all you have to do is click on that button that says See More, scroll down to the picture of Paul Barreca, and then you'll see one that says Trip to Greece, and it's 4 pages, that are actually 5 once you get the printout for the application, and as a result, you can actually join with us. We will fly out of Dallas, and so if you're not in Dallas, you fly to Dallas and then out, and it looks like a very simple and easy set of flights, and then we find ourselves in Thessaloniki. And there are just a lot of things that you will get to see that actually reinforce what you read in terms of the book of Acts. And I would certainly want to recommend some books that are out that would be things to read, but I'd also just encourage you to read through the book of Acts because it'll give you a pretty good idea, almost chronologically, where we're going to be each particular day.
One of the other things we'll be looking at is that Acts, of course, is chronological, but the epistles are not. And so a one-year Bible, either on YouVersion or perhaps whatever other Bible app you may be using, what that will do is that will put those books like Thessalonians, which was written probably first, it'll put those books in the right order, and interpose them into the book of Acts. So we'll be talking about those kinds of things in our Bible studies together.
Let me tell a few stories. First of all, when we got to Corinth, one of the things that was so surprising to me is you pull up in the bus and you see all of the remnants and the columns and everything, and our guide takes us down what looks like a goat path, and I'm going, where are we going with this? And it turns out that they had uncovered this area by a theater that actually names one of the people associated with Paul. And until they uncovered that, we had no evidence other than what the Bible had to say about this. One of these books that some of you scholars that get you, like you've gotten your doctorate, that read are talking about how in every single case we have, in many cases, archaeological evidence, historical evidence, or in some cases even just geographical evidence to prove that Luke, when he was writing the book of Acts, was giving us accurate information. But again, we will spend some time not only just saying, let's look at all the sights and sounds, but even how we live in this world that you and I have talked about many times, in which archaeology is proving the historicity of course, the Bible in of course, Jerusalem and all through Israel, but also proving the accuracy of the book of Acts as we go through Greece.
And we see so many times in Acts that there are, and in the epistles, names, dates, or not so much dates, but names and people and places. And those things, if you're going to write a general book like Nostradamus's prophecies, right? Well, they're kind of general, or the horoscope, right?
Yeah.
It could apply to anybody doing anything, anywhere, at any time. But Scripture is specific. And archaeology validates that and shows us the accuracy of God's Word. Gives us a lot of confidence in other things that God has said to us that are also true.
Well, again, we'll also be in front of Mars Hill right there in Athens. You always hear about that. Well, there it is. And, you see kids walking around and climbing on it and everything. So, again, if you are interested, we're coming to a break and we're going to move on to, of course, biblical prophecy. But if you are interested, you can either call and ask us to send you one of these brochures, or just simply, since most of you have very good computer expertise, you just simply go to the website, pointofview.net, click on the one that says Trip to Greece, and it gives you all the information that you need so that you can decide if you want to join with us. And as I understand now, we still have room on one bus, just one bus, right?
Yes, this one of the things that our guests have really appreciated about the Point of View tours is that we only do one bus, which means that you will be interacting with Kerby and myself and our guests. Makes a really, really nice group together. And yes, we do have some openings. However, the airfare portion of this will end mid-January, or at least the guaranteed airfare. Yeah. So we do want to encourage folks to be thinking about it. And if you intend to go, at least get in touch with us and the travel agent that we're using so that we can get your details and let you know that we can work things out.
Back to prophecy then. That's what we're going to spend the rest of our time on, and that's one of the reasons that Paul Barreca is in town. They have the pre-trib study group. I'll talk more about that when we come back from a break. But for those of you that have been making your way through the book of Revelation, so many of you, of course, go through Bible Study Fellowship, we're going to try to see if we can uncover a few things that maybe you haven't heard, because there's some new particular pieces of information that you'd like to know about. All that coming up right after this.
If you have ever wondered what kind of impact you have when you give to Point of View, let me introduce you to Bill. His story is a perfect illustration.
Well, I've been a supporter of Point of View since the 70s, and I appreciate the fact that truth and love are discussed equally and that God's Word never changes. We have 4 generations in my family who have been taught these things, these truths, and the 5th generation we've just been blessed with, who I'm sure will be blessed by this ministry also. So I just appreciate the fact that it's solid, it's truthful, it's honest, and there's no changing God's Word.
And that is the kind of multi-generational impact you have when you support Point of View. So give today. Equip the next generation with the clarity of God's unchanging Word. You can give online at pointofview.net or call us at 1-800-347-5151. That's pointofview.net and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again in studio with us, Dr. Paul Barreca, and we're going to be talking about prophecy for a couple of reasons. First of all, he was just here at the pre-trib study group, and that is the idea of pre-tribulation. It was started by Tim LaHaye and Tommy Ice and a variety of other people. We'll talk about that in just a minute. Also, I wanted to talk about it because we have noticed that there are fewer pastors that want to even talk about prophecy, and yet one of the things I think would be fair to say, Paul, is when we leave that out, Almost 27% of the Bible, when written, was prophetic in nature. And number two, just back to point of view, you've pointed out that many of the issues we talk about every single day here on Point of View, whether it's Israel, the Middle East, issue of culture, morality in America, a lot of those come back to prophecy, don't they?
There are so many prophetic statements about those things. And I think the biggest of that, of course, is Israel. And that's why in the 1950s, there was a tremendous resurgence or interest in biblical prophecy, because 1947, Israel becomes a nation. And wow, this nation that had not existed for almost 2,000 years, and even the Jewish language, the Hebrew language, being brought back. And this fits exactly with biblical prophecy. But since the 50s and 60s and 70s, that was a time of great interest. Of course, that's the time when Late Great Planet Earth was written by Hal Lindsey. And at the pre-trib study group this week, I heard some amazing facts about that Hal Lindsey had received 1 million letters from people that trusted Jesus by reading the Late Great Planet Earth. Over 40 million copies sold. And of those 1 million, 100,000 were Jewish people who read the book and trusted Christ. And so prophecy is super important. There's been a diminished level of interest in biblical prophecy. I'd say since about the 1990s. I was pastoring during these years, and of course I was preaching about this and teaching about this, and our people were interested, but not so much with a lot of other churches.
Yes. And I might just mention, of course, I'm going to be referring to some things. I'll hold up this book, Discovering Dispensationalism, and you had those speakers at the event. And some don't necessarily accept all of this, but I guess that gets us to another issue, and that is, why is it? I mean, there was a time in which there were all sorts of prophecy conferences. There still are some, and we've had Jack Hibbs on this program, and of course, Jack Graham was on this last week, and some of them have spoken to this issue, and there are certainly individuals that have written books on it, but there seems to be a great reluctance among people that are pastors, and you interact with these pastors both as a former pastor and as a mission leader. Can you explain maybe why that's happening?
Well, I think one of the reasons I find some legitimacy in it, because I agree that there have been prophetic statements by some within the, let's say, the pre-tribulation or the premillennial camp, where they're doing things like telling you when Jesus is going to come, 88 reasons why Jesus is returning in 1988, and all kinds of books. Right. And people would kind of sensationalize this. And of course, when those things don't come true, and, we should never set dates. The Lord's not told us to do that. Some also do something I call soft date setting. And they'll say something like this: well, we may not know the date, but we can know the hour. And, Jesus is going to come back before the turn of the millennium. And yeah, those false prognostications have, I think, done great harm to the pre-tribulation, premillennial position. Some have said, hey, this is the Antichrist. It's Tony Blair, it's Ronald Reagan, it's Henry Kissinger, and on and on and on. Yeah. I would say this, though, that prominent dispensational teachers strongly condemn date setting and naming of who the Antichrist is. That tends to be people who sensationalize, but those who are the prominent dispensationalist teachers really condemn those things.
Well, and the other one that comes up all the time, and there's even a chapter in this book that you gave to me, again, 360 pages of great material, is the issue of John Nelson Darby, J.N. Darby. And the argument is, as well, this idea of a millennium, an idea of a pre-tribulation and 7 years of a tribulation, of pre-tribulation rapture and a tribulation and a millennium, those all came with this one individual. And that's where some of the new scholarship, if you will, is pointing out, no, you can go all the way back to the 1st and 2nd century and see people talking about this. It wasn't some new American or British doctrine that surfaced just a century ago.
Yes, the idea of the imminency of the return of Christ, and the idea of, not so much the idea, but the teaching of a literal kingdom in which Jesus rules and reigns on earth. Those thoughts go back to the 1st century. And we have new discoveries. When we say new discoveries, what we mean is that we have found and translated ancient patristic writings.
Right.
And there are still, believe it or not, there are thousands and thousands of writings that have not been translated. As scholars work on those,
isn't that amazing?
they're discovering these things. So we have first century Irenaeus talking about the imminency of the Lord's return, even mentioning pre-tribulational rapture from Irenaeus and from other first century, second century, and third century church fathers. And one of the things that we think may have happened is that in Augustine and forward, of course, Augustine, City of God, and really becomes the primary person promoting the doctrine that is consistent through the Roman Catholic Church of amillennialism. There is no literal kingdom in which Jesus rules. This is the kingdom now. Those scholars, those scribes, the librarians, the people who kept the scrolls, post-Augustine, whenever they read something that might be a little bit talking about the millennial kingdom from one of the early church fathers, well, they just kind of erase that out. We don't want that. That doesn't fit with our...
Didn't pass it on.
Yeah. And so now we're discovering more and more of those. And I might just recommend a couple of resources to your audience. Ancient Dispensational Truth is one of those. A great book that covers that. And this book here that you've held up, Discovering Dispensationalism by Corey Marsh and James Fazio, two amazing scholars that have documented many of these new discoveries.
One of the things I've been doing in my Sunday school class is after we teach the sessions for 3 weeks in a row, I've taken a few chapters from this new book by David Jeremiah on the Golden Kingdom, in which he kind of said to himself one time, okay, I've written a book on the rapture and I've written a book on the tribulation, and so maybe it's time to write a book on the kingdom, on the millennium. And he said, I had no idea how much there was, because you normally think, for our listeners that are right now working their way through the book of Revelation, well, when I get to Revelation 20, 21, 23, 22, I get to the millennium, but then you realize there are all these other references in Ezekiel and Zechariah and Isaiah and others. And so I, again, would commend to people his book. I don't know that we'll be able to get him on the program, but I've enjoyed learning that. And that's a real popular type book, but it helps us clarify some of the misinformation that people have. And in some respects, that's really kind of what we're talking about. But just before we take a break, give us a brief overview of what this idea of premillennialism is. In other words, we believe in a millennium and we believe we're in the church age, but how do those two come together?
Well, it starts in the Old Testament. One of my professors at seminary, Michael, said that if you study the Old Testament first, you become a dispensationalist. If you study the New Testament first, you become a covenant theologian. So it is understanding and interpreting the Old Testament, particularly Old Testament prophecies, literally.
Right. That
when it talks about a kingdom. Now, in the Old Testament, they may not have understood all that meant, but there are so many prophecies in the books you mentioned. I love particularly the ones in Zechariah, chapters 12 through 14. And we read in those prophecies throughout the Old Testament about this event called the Day of the Lord.
Right.
And we read about that also in 2 Thessalonians.
2 Thessalonians, yes.
Where Paul writes to the Thessalonians and tells them that don't be deceived that the day of the Lord has come and that you've missed it. And it's amazing that so many pastors and scholars will read that verse and never ask, what is the day of the Lord and where do we find that? We find it in the Old Testament.
And I might just mention, you've got some links here to Zechariah 12 and 13 and 14. We'll come back and mention some of that. And that's also another reason that I've used, and you've heard me use it before, and I think I've said it on the air, but it's worth saying one more time because I used it the other day when we had Gary Fraser. And that is, when you read the book of 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, these were written very early, and they were written by Paul after he'd only spent at best 2 or 3 weeks with them, and yet he's telling them to think back on what he's told them about prophecy. So for a pastor to say, well, I don't think we really need to cover prophecy for a young believer, that's exactly what Paul did. He is referring back to teachings he's already given on the day of the Lord, on the return of Christ, on the coming kingdom, to a group of individuals that he's only spent a few weeks actually teaching biblical principles. So is prophecy important? I think that it is, and you can see that certainly just in the example of 1 Thessalonians. But we'll come back, and I thought maybe you could read some of those passages in Zechariah, because I think it is really also important that we are starting to see some pastors saying, we don't even need to read the Old Testament. We just need to read the New Testament. So we're going to get into the Old Testament and point it back to prophecy right after this.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, if you'd like to join the conversation, 1-800-351-1212, or maybe sit back and take some notes, because we're going to, or maybe get your Bible out. First of all, go to 2 Thessalonians, and then we're going to go to Zechariah 12 through 14. It's a very good look at this idea of the day of the Lord. Explain that, if you might.
Yeah, so we come to 2 Thessalonians 2, and thank you so much for sharing that reminder that this is a new church. Paul being there just a short amount of time, he writes 1 Thessalonians, and then he writes to them in 2 Thessalonians because there was a concern among the Thessalonian believers. Paul was talking about the day of the Lord in 1 Thessalonians 4. He talks about the harpazo. We use the word rapture, which is the Latin word, but the Greek word is harpazo, the catching up and being with the Lord. And some of them were saying, oh, we might have missed this. And so Paul says this, concerning the coming of the Lord Jesus, or our being gathered together to him. We're going to talk about that in a minute. The difference between being gathered to Jesus, that's the rapture or harpazo, and then the return of Jesus when Jesus comes to earth. But Paul says, don't be discouraged or shaken that the day of the Lord has come. That's 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, verse 2. So what is the day of the Lord? Well, it's spoken of extensively in the Old Testament. And one of those is in Zechariah chapter 12 and verse 10. I will pour out on the house of David and the inhabitants of Jerusalem a spirit of grace and pleas of mercy, so that when they look on me on whom they have pierced, they shall mourn for him as one mourns for an only child, and weep bitterly over him as one weeps over a firstborn. So something's going to happen in Israel where they will look to Jesus, and the nation, or the remnant of the nation, will turn to him. And it certainly does not appear that that has happened in any sense. It's very rare to find a Jewish believer. We have some very good friends that are Jewish believers, but that certainly is not the majority. And then we come a little bit later to Zechariah chapter 13. This whole passage here, this prophetic passage, is talking about the day of the Lord. And here's the phrase, on that day there shall be a fountain opened for the house of David and the inhabitants of Jerusalem. We don't have time in this short broadcast to go over all of that, but encourage you to read Zechariah chapter 10 through 14, and it's talking about the day of the Lord. Zechariah 14, verses 3 and 4, the Lord will go out and fight against those nations as when he fights on the day of battle. On that day, the day of the Lord, his feet shall stand on the Mount of Olives that lies before Jerusalem on the east, and the Mount of Olives shall be split in two from east to west, a very wide valley, so that one half of the mountain will move north, the other half moving south. And those day of the Lord references are super important.
Yes, and again, the idea of the Lord coming and splitting Mount of Olives. Turns out there is a earthquake fault there, but I think it's also supernatural and just some great ideas. But one of the other things you alluded to, and that is the difference between Jesus comes for his saints and Jesus comes with his saints, the difference between the rapture and the return. Can you help us with that?
Absolutely. So when we read the language, I think the first place in the New Testament that speaks about the rapture is John 14:3, where Jesus says to his disciples in the upper room before his departure, I go to prepare a place for you, and if I go, I will come again and receive you to myself. That's the picture of Jesus meeting with the church. It's the same where we read about that in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, verses 6 through 17, that those who are alive and remain until the coming of the Lord will be caught up together. That's the word harpazo, caught up together with the Lord to meet the Lord in the air. Very important, because at the second coming, Jesus comes, and we just read from Zechariah chapter 14, which is a messianic prophecy, day of the Lord, where Jesus will come on the culmination of the day of the Lord, and he comes and his feet land on the earth, and he comes in judgment. He comes through the eastern gate in Jerusalem. He enters into the city of Jerusalem as a conqueror and establishing his kingdom. So those two events are different. The rapture of the church, and again, I would just remind you, not all of our listeners follow this doctrine. We're presenting it, not as a form of orthodoxy, but certainly what I believe, and many others as well. And the rapture, Jesus comes for the church, and the tribulation follows. In the second coming, Jesus comes for Israel. He comes as their Redeemer.
And there's a judgment there, and you see that in Revelation 19, and he refers to it in Matthew 24 and other passages, and those kind of all come together. So in some respects, the way in which we look at these passages comes from more of a literal reading. Last time we had John MacArthur on, it's been years, but he said, if I go through the book of Revelation and I assume that this happens before this happens, before this happens, if I read it chronologically, of course, the first chapters, of course, deal with the churches. But once you get to Revelation 4 and afterwards, this happens, then this happens, this happens, I would come up with the plan that we so often see given by prophetic teachers, because we assume that all of that has some literalness, and as a result, then is looking to some future event. Is that fair?
Very fair. And not only a literal reading of the book of Revelation, but a literal reading of Daniel. key moment because Daniel writing during a time of the Babylonian exile, and the people were concerned about Israel. And so Daniel chapter 9, Daniel tells them, hey, here's what's going to happen to Israel. The same as in Matthew 24 and 25, reading that literally. And that's one thing about the dispensational view that I appreciate so much, is that it provides great congruity for Scripture and the ability to just read things in their plain meaning, in their plain sense. There is figurative language, of course, throughout the Bible, just as we use figurative language every day in every conversation. But that doesn't mean that all biblical prophecy in the Old Testament is figurative. It is literal and can be interpreted that way.
One of the booklets we have, of course, is on messianic prophecy, which is a good thing to talk about during this Christmas season because some of those have to do with the birth of Christ. But I'd be remiss if I didn't have the executive director of Fellowship International Mission to talk about if somebody is thinking about missions, or maybe knows somebody's a missionary that maybe isn't necessarily feeling like that is the best fit for their mission work. If they contact you at fim.org, you could certainly chat with them, of course, about everything from prophecy to missions, right?
That's right. And we're very blessed to be able to be sending missionaries around the world. We have missionaries in 30 countries, one of many mission agencies, but one that really emphasizes evangelism and biblical accuracy. These things are important, and we want people to be teaching them so that the body of Christ can be blessed and can grow. So we'd love to talk to someone about missions or supporting a missionary. And if God has blessed you and you want to expand the gospel, that's just as important as those who go.
I might also mention, as people have probably figured out, since you teach at Word of Life, you're just at Scroon Lake, and of course you've spoken at the Philippines, Hungary, and others. Sometimes when you want to bring a missionary in, we love their work, but sometimes they're not a great preacher or teacher, but you are. You've been a pastor for many years, and so if you would like to have somebody kick off your missions conference, I would certainly recommend Dr. Paul Barreca. And one last time, let me just mention that we do have that Greece trip, and so if you would like to know more about that, you know somebody that might be interested, you can go to the website pointofview.net. If they would like to hear the interview again, you can go to that red button that says watch or listen. Of course, we have a button there for donations, and of course now we have our banner up there because we have a matching challenge for fiscal year end. So Paul Barreca, always great to be with you, and looking forward to our trip to Greece.
Thank you, Kerby. Blessings to you, and a great joy to share these truths around Christmas time as well.
We're going to take a break and get into some of the issues in the news. We have a lot to cover and to talk about, so let's take a break. If you find yourself saying, well, I'd like to know a little bit more, you can click on that button that says See More. You can find out more about Paul Barreca. Click on that button that will take you to fim.org, God's Passion for Your Call. If you're thinking about becoming a missionary or supporting a missionary, we've got that link. And, of course, we have the link to the trip to Greece, all that coming up, and we'll take a break and come back with more right after this.
If you have ever wondered what kind of impact you have when you give to Point of View, let me introduce you to Bill. His story is a perfect illustration.
Well, I've been a supporter of Point of View since the 70s, and I appreciate the fact that truth and love are discussed equally and that God's Word never changes. We have 4 generations in my family who have been taught these things, these truths, and the 5th generation we've just been blessed with, who I'm sure will be blessed by this ministry also. So I just appreciate the fact that it's solid, it's truthful, it's honest, and there's no changing God's Word.
And that is the kind of multi-generational impact you have when you support Point of View. So give today. Equip the next generation with the clarity of God's unchanging Word. You can give online at pointofview.net or call us at 1-800-347-5151. That's pointofview.net and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
Going through the stations and caught Kerby and a very interesting topic. So just listening to it, and so just by hearing the topic, I can relate to some of those topics. But it has impacted my life a lot. I enjoy listening to the station.
I appreciate Point of View. You've been great and wonderful. A lot of information, and I really appreciate all your work you do.
My wife and I have listened to Point of View for about 17 years now. We just want you to know how much you have meant to us in our lives. I've gotten a real education since I've started listening to Point of View.
I want you to think, what would we do? How ignorant would we be if we didn't have Point of View? And come on, guys, give something to Point of View to make sure we don't lose this wonderful voice. And thanks again for what you do.
Thank you, Kerby. I consider this my school time, so my 2 hours of school each day. So thank you very much.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Second hour today, we're going to get into some other issues. Of course, we will say just a little bit more about the individual that tried to kill that, and actually did kill, the CEO, oftentimes referred to as the CEO assassin. I still have a question as to whether or not, when do we use the word assassination and not? Obviously, we use that when we talk about political figures. Does a CEO qualify? We'll just call it a CEO assassin. And more importantly, some of the reactions that have been sympathetic to the murder that took place, and so we'll cover some of that. A very good piece that came out by David Keating about not only do we need a DOGE, that is a Department of Government Efficiency, to begin to streamline government, we need something very similar to actually focus on free speech. And then I will spend some time talking about some of the attacks, whether it has been some of the threats on cabinet nominees, or even an individual was arrested for allegedly assaulting Representative Nancy Mace. We also have my commentaries that I've had over the last 2 days on propaganda tests, and maybe a few other topics we can get into in the short hour that we have here. I hope you appreciated the conversation we had with Dr. Paul Barreca. He is still hanging around. We're going to go to dinner after this, but I just wanted to spend some time letting you know, first of all, that we do still have room for you on a trip to Greece. And number two, I wanted you to hear some of the things just coming out of their prophecy conference, which are new and exciting and innovative. So all that is front and center. And let me, if I can now, get to, of course, what has unfolded over the last couple of days. And that is, we know a lot more about the shooter now. As a matter of fact, yesterday, when he was actually being brought into the Blair County Courthouse in Pennsylvania, shouting out all sorts of things, and his explosion, as the particular article I have in front of me, came just 24 hours after he appeared in court for his arraignment. You're not familiar, this individual, and I intentionally don't use his name, faces 2 counts of second-degree criminal possession of a weapon, 1 count of second-degree possession of a forged document, 1 count of third-degree criminal possession, and, of course, a first, I guess is now a second-degree murder charge. All of that is going to make it very difficult for him to ever see the light of day once again. He was caught, if you've not heard the story, with several fake IDs, a ghost gun, a silencer, which they believe was used to murder the individual who was the CEO of the health company. He also, interestingly enough, was caught by people that said, gosh, doesn't that guy kind of look like that assassin? And one of the men in Altoona, Pennsylvania, said it really kind of started out as a joke. And then somebody else said, well, he does kind of look like that guy. And now they're about 10 feet away from him, and he didn't leave. He had a mask, a hood, and a backpack. And so eventually the worker that took the order thought, oh, he looks too much like it. Part of it was the eyebrows. You've heard people talk about that before. And so he was taken into custody. And, of course, there are people trying to make sense of what he did. And yet I think the simple issue is he wanted to kill people, and he killed an individual based upon, I think, all sorts of misguided reasons, from any kind of mental issue to also being further radicalized. I want to get to our 2 articles that I've posted for you to read because I think they really take us on to some of these issues. But you've got to understand that his sister, who's a cardiologist at a teaching hospital near the medical school, not just many miles from where we're broadcasting from today, was horrified by this. And of course, the whole family has said, well, our family is shocked and devastated by that. And they asked for prayer for Thompson's family and for praying for all that was involved. Yes, there are people saying, how is it that we had pictures of this individual and no family member said, wait a minute, I think that's my son. I think that's my brother. And again, he was estranged for them, so who knows. But what I do want to focus on, because we'll learn more about him as time goes on, the really sad commentary that has come from individuals who actually wanted to almost try to give some justification for his actions. And my first article is from somebody I quote from quite often, Jim Garrity, who said, you know, when people are trying to figure out what he wanted to do, well, he says it's just really simple. He wanted to kill somebody. Yesterday, they arrested him, of course, in the McDonald's in Altoona, Pennsylvania. Of course, this came from yesterday, so it's the day before. And then, of course, there are a million ways that this individual could have made the world a better place. And in some respects, we've learned enough to know that he had the ability and even the resources to have made it a better world. First of all, he was born into a wealthy family, Jim Garrity reminds us. His family owns several country clubs, including the Hayesfield Country Club in Hunts Valley. He has a cousin who is actually a Republican delegate in Maryland. His late grandfather was a self-made real estate developer. So not only did he come from a family that had financial means, he also went to a very prestigious prep school, the Gilman School. Did I hear somebody the other day said that tuition there was $40,000 a year? He was a leader in the Student Robotics Club. He also had later on been involved as a head counselor for pre-collegiate studies program for those heading off to Stanford University. He was not only the valedictorian from the Gilman School, but also went to the University of Pennsylvania and received what? Not only a bachelor's degree, but a master's degree in engineering with a major in computer and information science. Then he even worked for a while with a Maryland-based studio that is known for some of these video games. And in some respects, everything looked pretty good until he decided to take a break and go to Honolulu. That time he started a book club in Hawaii, and one of the books that certainly caused a lot of concern was the book by the Unabomber, The Manifesto. And as a result, they even provided a 4-star review of this book called Industrial Society and Its Future, which was written by Ted Kaczynski, who is, of course, best known as the Unabomber. So here we have this, if you will, descent from an individual that is a robotics whiz, majored in computer science, worked at a video game company, had all sorts of success, and then he kind of signs on to with the Unabomber's Manifesto and then begins to complain about health care. One thing Jim Garrity points out, at the age of 26, if he was under the Affordable Care Act, he may have only paid for health insurance once, maybe not have paid for health insurance. And yet that becomes then, if you will, the justification for some of these individuals saying, well, he was justified because of all the problems in the healthcare industry. As one person said, John Wick meets Aaron Brockovich. And so when we come back from the break, I want to talk about that because, again, there's so many things he could have done. Jim Garrity talks about you could have given money to the National Association of Free and Charitable Clinics. You could have been providing ways to help defray the cost for individuals that maybe had to engage in some kind of health studies or research or surgeries, and that's not what he did. We now know what he did do, but when we come back, we'll talk about some of the people that thought maybe he was justified. What about that? Talk about this right after that.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Yesterday, I talked about some of the tests Glenn Beck proposes in his new book, Propaganda Wars. The first three are the liar, liar test, the what is a woman test, and the egg-throwing gorilla test. If you don't know what those are, you might consult the transcript for yesterday's commentary. His fourth test is the bias test. People and institutions are more likely to cite facts that support their ideological or religious views. If a secular liberal news source reports something favorable to conservatives or Christians, it is likely to be true. The fifth test he calls the bloodthirsty tyrant test. If someone supports or calls for violence, you should not trust that information. The mainstream media has frequently downplayed the violence and threats from Antifa. He argues that if you think your cause is so righteous that it justifies burning cities down, then you shouldn't trust that source. Another test is the original source test. This test is more difficult because you shouldn't always take at face value a statement that isn't a first-hand account. It takes time and patience to find the original source. Glenn Beck devotes a few pages to show how the false story of 500 people who died in a hospital in Gaza was repeated verbatim by multiple outlets. A final test is the crazy uncle test. Along with Christmas carols and Thanksgiving turkeys, one American holiday tradition is getting trapped by a completely absurd conversation with a crazy uncle. Glenn Beck suggests we treat the entire social media industry as though it is a crazy uncle. You will need wisdom and a degree of skepticism to navigate the propaganda wars in the 21st century. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kerby's booklet, A Biblical View on Loneliness, go to viewpoints.info/loneliness. That's viewpoints.info/loneliness. You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, second article that we've posted here today by Charlie Cook. As a matter of fact, there have been a whole search of really good articles, but I picked this one because it's a reminder of the kind of responses that have been given to the murder of this CEO of United Healthcare. And he points out that this has been met with two, what he calls disgraceful responses. I agree. One explicitly grotesque, the other implicitly so. The first, the explicitly grotesque response, has been to openly cheer the death of Brian Thompson and to cheer on the murderer, the individual that is now in custody, on the grounds that he deserved to die. Now, the reality is most of those have shown up in social media and should be outrageously condemned. One of those individuals that has actually made that statement lost her job, and I think justifiably so. But then he goes on to talk about what he calls the implicitly grotesque response has been to declare that one is against the idea of an assassination of a CEO of United Healthcare, but at least I can kind of understand it, maybe even sympathize with that, and then gives you some very good examples from mainstream media, from various professors at universities and the rest. You can read through that paragraph. I won't bore you with a long list. And then he says, really, the question is, we should ask why a human being was murdered in cold blood and why it is justifiable to imply that there might be sufficient reason for that act. He says there does not, and there is no reason for that. He says, I have no interest in negotiating with those who disagree. He says, what I will do, however, is attempt to convey to those figures exactly why their reactions are so misplaced, and indeed why condemnation of it is the prerequisite to a functioning civil society. The Washington Post, for example, he does quote. Of course, he gives you quotes from CNN, CBS, New York Times, people at Columbia, all sorts of places. But Washington Post says this violent attack on one man is really an attack on society itself. That is correct. And he says, why? Well, because everyone has grievances. There's nothing within our social compact that permits a small subset of them to exempt themselves from its elementary standards. Were America to adopt such a system, which we unfortunately find in other countries, then would remain not only an attack on people like the CEO of United Healthcare, but you could replace the word CEO with a senator, a representative, maybe the director of health and human services or the like. We saw some of that, of course, even with, well, maybe I can understand why some people would be upset with Donald Trump and why you could understand why an assassination would take place. And he says the New York Times in particular has been keen to inform its readers about the hate and the anger and the frustration and rage against health insurance providers that supposedly exist in the land. But he says, wait a minute. If indeed that is justifiable, he says we really don't even have to imagine a different scenario, because what if indeed that CEO was maybe the CEO of ABC News, or maybe the editor of the Washington Post and the New York Times? Unlike health insurance, it is an indisputable fact that a supermajority of Americans hate the legacy media, and that a majority of Americans exhibit anger, frustration, and rage towards it. But you might say, well, yeah, but we're talking about health care. Well, then he gives you another example. He says in one of the really craven pieces from the New York Times, they talk about how a doctor proposes that Thompson's assassination, that is assassination of, again, the CEO of United Healthcare, reignited people's contempt for their health plans, and that this matters for how it lays bare America's deep-seated anger towards healthcare. Well, at this point, Charles Cook says, well, then let's just take you back 15 years, because at that time we had a president, his name was Barack Obama, who inspired precisely those emotions in a majority of the country's voters. You might remember, those of you that have been around for a while, between 2009 and 2014, this country was riven, he uses the word with contempt and deep-seated anger towards the Affordable Care Act. His opponents staged massive protests. They held raucous town halls. They griped to every pollster who would listen. And in 2010, they delivered an electoral shellacking to Obama's political party. And the point he's making is, if indeed this has reignited some of the people's concerned about health care, and in some respects, that's sort of an implicit understanding why somebody would want to actually kill the CEO of United Healthcare, I don't think anybody back then would have said that would have been justification for trying to assassinate Barack Obama. And so I think it's an illustration that sometimes we see a justification for violence, and that justification for violence is used if it fits with our particular political understanding. And as I mentioned just a few minutes ago, and it's worth mentioning again, the Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson, put out this particular tweet. He says, this year there have not been just one, but two assassination attempts on President Trump. Now some of Trump's cabinet nominees and their families are facing bomb threats. He says this is dangerous and unhinged. It is not who we are in America. Joe Biden and all Democratic leaders have an obligation to speak up and condemn this right now. One of the examples which we can now point to went from just a threat to an actual assault, and that is the Capitol Police yesterday, actually last night, if I want to be honest about when it took place, actually have been able to arrest a man who actually assaulted Representative Nancy Mace. She's a Republican from South Carolina. You might remember that she wanted to make sure that even a transgender man, now calling himself, now herself, a woman, would not be using the women's bathrooms in Capitol Hill. And she said on X, "I was physically assaulted and accosted tonight on Capitol grounds over my fight to protect women, and the Capitol Police have arrested him." She goes on to say, "All violence and threats keep proving our point. Women deserve to be safe. Your threats will not stop my fight for women." And it sort of brings us back to one of the things I have mentioned on the last 2 days in my commentary. For those of you watching online, I'm holding up the latest book by Glenn Beck. And Glenn Beck has a chapter in there in which he talks about how to know what is true. And he gives us 7 different points that he makes. The first test to evaluate whether something is true is what he calls the liar-liar test. If somebody has lied to you before, uses the example in 2020 when multiple media outlets and 51 current and former government officials knowingly lied about the Hunter Biden laptop, maybe you shouldn't be so trusting of them the next time. The second one he calls a what is a woman test, when an expert says that something and is obviously wrong, we can recognize that we might, as reasonable people, might disagree on many topics, but we wouldn't want to trust an expert that doesn't seem to have basic common sense. His third test is what he calls the egg-throwing gorilla test. Our listeners in California would know this one because that's when Larry Elder, who's black, ran for California governor. He was attacked for being racist. One LA Times reporter claimed Elder had a white supremacist worldview. And as a matter of fact, one woman even went to the rallies wearing a gorilla mask and threw eggs at him. And again, you don't have to believe people that make up those kinds of statements. A fourth test was the bias test. If somebody cites facts that are contrary to their ideological religious views, probably true because most people tend to only cite facts that reinforce their view. And this brings us to the one I'm talking about now. He calls this the bloodthirsty tyrant test. If someone supports or calls for violence, you should not trust that information. And there seems to be a lot of that bloodthirsty tyrant test that we can apply right now as we begin to see some of the attacks that are taking place, some of the threats that are taking place, and he even uses the example that indeed the mainstream media has been downplaying the threats from Antifa and from some of the unhinged left. And if you think your case is so righteous it justifies burning down cities or attacking people, maybe I shouldn't trust you either. So this commentary over the last 2 days has been about some of these tests that have been suggested by Glenn Beck. There's some of the same kind of tests we use around here at Point of View to decide what is true and what is not true. And as a matter of fact, one of the reasons we talk so often about Truth Team and Truth Team Week, and even next year our theme is Anchored for Truth, is because we think the battle for truth is essential. And if you agree with that, you might click on our banner here, which talks about the gift of truth. We'll be right back.
If you have ever wondered what kind of impact you have when you give to Point of View, let me introduce you to Bill. His story is a perfect illustration.
Well, I've been a supporter of Point of View since the 70s. And I appreciate the fact that truth and love are discussed equally and that God's word never changes. We have 4 generations in my family who have been taught these things, these truths, and the 5th generation we've just been blessed with, who I'm sure will be blessed by this ministry also. So I just appreciate the fact that it's solid, it's truthful, it's honest, and there's no changing God's word.
And that is the kind of multi-generational impact you have when you support Point of View. So give today. Equip the next generation with the clarity of God's unchanging word. You can give online at pointofview.net or call us at 1-800-347-5151. That's pointofview.net, and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again, I thought I'd talk about a couple things that have developed in the news over the last half hour or so. I want to thank Paul Barreca, who's still around here to actually identify some of those. I was going to talk about this tomorrow, but might as well talk about it today, and that is there are people that are now well aware of the fact that one of the reasons there's some concern about Kash Patel coming into the FBI is there's now pretty good evidence of the fact that the FBI director, that would be McCabe, back in 2017, he's the one who also signed the illegal FISA warrant on Donald Trump, also ordered Google plus Apple not to disclose to Kash Patel or others that they were targets of the FBI who were spying on them. Kash Patel will be, of course, the nominee put forward by Donald Trump, and I think is somebody who is seen as somewhat controversial because, if nothing else, you think he would probably want to get rid of Christopher Wray. Well, it's pretty obvious now that Christopher Wray is on the way out. Christopher Wray is the FBI director, but just think about this for a minute. If you are dealing with the Justice Department and the FBI, okay, first of all, the FBI director in 2017 was McCabe. The FBI director over the last couple of years has been Christopher Wray. He would have to have renewed the order. So we now recognize that for the, let's say, last 7 years, the FBI has indeed been spying on who now might be the new FBI director. You see where that takes you, and you can see why there are a couple of individuals that have decided that they're going to probably step down before, of course, Donald Trump will fire them. So it's kind of intriguing to see how that one has unfolded. And the other one has to do with the drone footage. If you were listening to our Millennial Roundtable yesterday, you probably have heard about the fact that we've had these mystery drones in the air. So we have lights in the sky. Just because we have lights in the sky doesn't mean we have little green men. Well, there was a very famous book that I've quoted before, Lights in the Sky and Little Green Men, which is kind of a Christian view of what about UFOs. And just because they're UFOs, although we call them different things now, doesn't mean that they are aliens. But it's been interesting since so much of that has happened in New Jersey. And when we had Paul Barreca here, I was going to ask him about that because he used to live in New Jersey. The governor of the state of New Jersey, Phil Murphy, has said that these drones are very sophisticated. He says the minute we get eyes on them, the drones go dark. He says, I don't blame people for being frustrated, but a lot of people want to know what's going on because these drones have gone over a number of things, including the Picatinny Arsenal, which is an Army facility in Morris County. And, of course, these are technically UFOs, but doesn't mean that's necessarily little green men. But one of the things I was going to quote from is one of the individuals that Paul knows is Representative Jeff Van Drew. He is an individual that when we first started talking about him years ago was a Democrat, then became a Republican, and more recently had said on Fox News from very high sources, very qualified sources, very responsible sources, I'm going to tell you the real deal. Iran launched a mothership probably about a month ago that contains these drones. That mothership is off the east coast of the United States of America. They've launched drones in everything that we can see or hear, and these come from high sources. These drones should be shot down, whether it was some crazy hobbyist that we can't imagine or whether it is Iran. I think it's very possible it could be. They should be shot down. They're not getting the full deal, and the military is on alert with this. Well, that's the statement he made before. No surprise, the Pentagon said today that there is no evidence that drones that have been spotted over New Jersey were from a foreign entity or adversary, and dismissed a claim by a U.S. lawmaker, well, you heard who that was, being launched off of an Iranian mothership. So first of all, where did he come up with that if indeed that isn't the case? And so you don't know if the Pentagon is just trying to tamp down some of those statements or whether that was was an erroneous statement. But nevertheless, it seems like every single day here on Point of View, we have something to talk about. And those drones are going to be something we'll pay attention to. And we'll see whether or not a member of Congress or the Pentagon turn out to be accurate in some of the statements they have made. So anyway, let me get to one more piece of information that I thought you would find very helpful. And as you probably figured out by now, all sorts of things I was going to talk about we'll probably have to postpone till tomorrow. But that's okay. We've got a little bit of time with our two guests tomorrow, and I'll mention who they are in just a minute. But my next article is by David Keating, and I think he's got a good idea here. He's the president now of what's called the Institute for Free Speech. Of course, we've had him on many years ago talking about many conservative ideas, but he starts out by saying this, that Donald Trump proposes to cut bureaucratic waste to the Department of Government Efficiency, known as DOGE. He should apply the same approach to free speech. He suggests a task force, which he could name the Federal Initiative to Reduce Speech Threats, or call it FIRST. So we have DOGE. And the fact that he suggests this in the Wall Street Journal suggests that maybe something like this might happen. This group called FIRST, if it was indeed implemented, could identify federal regulations and guidelines that harm speech or new rules that could protect it. And he gives you three very good examples of that. The first is what he calls new rules for bureaucrats. Turns out that federal law grants very broad powers to people in the executive branch to regulate employees' conduct. And this case known as Murphy versus Missouri really had to do with more social media, helped expose how federal employees facilitated the censorships through social media platforms. In other words, the federal government cannot censor you, but the federal government can encourage others, like social media, to censor you and then have clean hands. And so this could be a desire to rewrite the rules that would prohibit the censorship. In case you are interested, yes, we have a booklet that I produced recently on censorship that goes into this in some detail. What are some of the legal issues? What are some of the constitutional issues? And what could be done? And so this piece by David Keating is on the website, and you could read it and then put that together with some of the material that is in my booklet, which again is free of charge. The second area he talks about is the Johnson Amendment. If you're not familiar with that, that was implemented in 1954 by then Senator Lyndon Johnson, which says that a 501c3 organization cannot be involved in direct political activity. Now, it was really intended to kind of constrain some of the anti-communist groups that were coming against him in the campaign. It was passed without any kind of discussion. It was a voice vote, but it has been sometimes used to say, as we've talked about before, that churches and pastors cannot address political issues. Now, the IRS, it turns out, actually has had quite a bit of latitude that has been given to pastors. There's only been one church that's ever even been threatened with this, and that didn't last very long. But still, it's somewhat murky, and sometimes it can actually be used as a target to maybe eliminate unfavorable speech towards a political candidate, towards a particular government agency, can have a real chilling effect. And so the other thing that this so-called FIRST, or Federal Initiative to Reduce Speech Threats, could do would be to clarify the Johnson Amendment, which has certainly needed some clarification even from the Supreme Court. And then the last one has to do with the Securities and Exchange Commission, because there are limits on any kind of political donations. The SEC imposes very strict contribution limits for people that are like investment advisors. And so, again, these are attempts to, in many cases, prevent or censor or prohibit or constrain free speech. And so the idea is we do have a First Amendment. But oftentimes, as he points out, federal agencies too often serve as censors, and this organization could prevent them from censoring again. And abolishing or reforming speech restricting regulations would allow us to have greater freedom of speech. And it kind of goes hand in hand with some of the things we've talked about with Kelly Shackelford. We have more freedom in terms of religious liberty than we've ever had before. And we also need more freedom in terms of the free speech rights that each American should enjoy. So it's a good piece. I thought you would appreciate some of the material that he's put together, and whether or not there is a group called First, similar to Doge, will be something we'll be monitoring. But if you first hear about it, actually, you first heard about First right here on Point of View. We'll take a break, come back with more right after this.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes. Let me just mention tomorrow we're going to be talking about a book, Trust Matters, and I think you're going to see how important that is. We've talked about the issue of truth, and the last 2 days, my Viewpoints commentaries have talked about propaganda tests and propaganda evaluation of whether somebody is truthful to you, and of course we wonder who we can trust, so I think you'll really appreciate the conversation tomorrow about Trust Matters. And then we'll also do a short piece on Angel Tree because, again, in the Christmas season, there is a time for us to give back, and I'd like to give you some examples, and that's one more example of something you can do to make something very special for a family that desperately would benefit from your financial and personal involvement in their lives. So just a few things we'll talk about. Then we'll get an update on all of those issues. I started the program today knowing that we might be talking about missions, and I thought we would certainly be talking about prophecy, and I knew we would cover a little bit of the reaction to the shooter, the murderer, but I really didn't think we would necessarily today get into talking about drones, and yet there we are talking about drones. I guess I should have, since we talked, or the Millennial Roundtable yesterday did. If I talk about UFOs too long, Megan's going to get a piece of aluminum foil and make me a tinfoil hat, come in here and put it on my head. But nevertheless, that was a conversation that took place yesterday, and I didn't really think we'd get into the issue of Christopher Wray, but it looks like he's stepping down. So every single day, things are happening around here. And going back to the issue of drones, there are some people that have said this is, whether you agree with the Pentagon statement or not, or you agree with what one of the members of Congress from the state of New Jersey says, there have been some that have wondered if there is a foreign power that's trying to just test us. I mean, after all, we had a balloon that made its way through the entire expanse of the United States, and no action was taken. And some people have said, as we are in the midst of 40 days till Donald Trump takes over, are there going to be some nations, many of our adversaries, that want to test what Joe Biden can or cannot do? And that's a possibility, which brings me to my last article. This one is written by our good friend Byron York, who, of course, is the editor of a newspaper that has looked at this for some time. And he asked a really important question that's probably occurred to you. Can the nation wait until January 20th? He asked that because, after all, when he wrote this, Donald Trump still has to wait 40 days. When he wrote this, Joe Biden had 42 days, but now we're 2 more ahead. So it's still 40 days in which Joe Biden is still the president of the United States. And he says anybody watching the events in Paris over the weekend would think that President-elect Donald Trump has already taken office. Because not only was there in the Cathedral of Notre Dame, we talked about that yesterday, but he also took the time to meet with French President Emmanuel Macron and, of course, Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky. But he's still not the president. He still, of course, gets national briefings and things of that nature. He still, of course, has Secret Service protection, but he is not the president yet. And at the same time, we're watching how Donald Trump is quickly, as he says, assembling his administration. After several weeks of mostly quiet working, he's been speaking more publicly in recent days about what he will do when he assumes the presidency on January 20th. And many people, including, of all people, Politico, it's kind of left to center, Biden has effectively disappeared from the radar. And then others within the Democratic Party on Capitol Hill, even his own administration feels like he left the Oval Office weeks ago. So we have, at best, a caretaker president right now. That's not good. And yet he is still president of the United States. Donald Trump is not. If an emergency or a crisis arises, Joe Biden, President Biden, even in his weakened condition, he says, will have to deal with it. And right now, it doesn't seem like he's spending a whole lot of time trying to do anything other than Trump-proof some of his policies. Also, they're trying to push through somebody in the SEC right now that I hope it doesn't happen, but we'll get to that maybe another day. And then it goes on to say that certainly most Republicans and a lot of Democrats, even some Democrats and independents and all, would prefer the inauguration came before January 20th. Well, why is it January 20th? Well, it goes back to the fact that it used to be the inauguration was March 4th. And, of course, we have the 20th Amendment that then was ratified in 1933 to replace the earlier inauguration date of March 4th, simply because at that time we had the Great Depression, and there was a desire to actually speed that up. But even so, January 20th seems a long way away. Well, Byron York goes on to say that so the inauguration date is January 20th. It can't be changed without amending the Constitution. It's worked relatively well for the 90 years since it was implemented, but things have changed a little bit. I'm not sure we'll change it, but it's something to think about because he goes and gives a couple of examples. For example, when at the end of 8 years, rather exhausted President George W. Bush was kind of limping through his second term. That was a time when we had, of course, this crisis in 2008. You might remember that. And there were Democrats who were frustrated that it was taking time before a newly elected President Barack Obama could take office. Even after the 2020 election, there were some that wanted Donald Trump out of the office so Joe Biden could come into office. Of course, we know what happened there. And he says we have kind of a very unusual situation now. Joe Biden is 82 years of age. He is no longer mentally or physically up to the job of being a full-time president. And so Biden is ready to go. Trump is ready to replace him. But the Constitution demands that we wait till January 20th. And in these 40 days, let's just hope and pray. And I do mean pray because that's our latest Pray for America email that we are just sending out here. Pray for the transition, pray for a number of things, because indeed Donald Trump certainly can't wait any longer to get into office, and some of his nominees can't wait any longer to get into positions of authority because we still live in a very dangerous time. So pray for this country, and we'll certainly encourage you to do so. As I mentioned, my commentary over the next last 2 days had to do with some of the tests that our friend actually talked about, because Glenn Beck has come up with 7. I think I only mentioned 5. The other 2 were the original source test and then what was called the crazy uncle test. But whether you look at the bloodthirsty tyrant test, the bias test, the what is a woman test, the egg-throwing gorilla test, or the original source test, that's a good one. Go back to the original source. Glenn Beck spends pages talking about how this false story of 500 people who were died in a hospital in Gaza was repeated verbatim by all sorts of media outlets, and it wasn't right in the first place, and it just got wrong further down the line. It was the classic telephone test that you've heard of before. And of course, the crazy uncle test, he suggests that if you see it on social media, treat that with about as much credibility as the crazy uncle that maybe grabbed you at Thanksgiving, or the crazy uncle that might grab you at Christmas and tell you something that he's seen. And no, you don't have to believe that either. And just because it's in social media, you don't have to believe that as well. We'll try to sort out some of these claims and counterclaims tomorrow. And if not, we'll certainly get those solved by the end of the week, I would hope. And if you, again, value some of the information that we're making available today, there's a banner there to give the gift of truth. We have a $120,000 matching challenge, so it's a dollar for dollar match, and you could start giving even today if you'd like to do so. I want to thank Megan for help engineering the program. Steve, thank you for producing the program. We'll see you tomorrow right here on Point of View.
If you have ever wondered what kind of impact you have when you give to Point of View, let me introduce you to Bill. His story is a perfect illustration.
Well, I've been a supporter of Point of View since the 70s, and I appreciate the fact that truth and love are discussed equally and that God's Word never changes. We have 4 generations in my family who have been taught these things, these truths, and the 5th generation we've just been blessed with, who I'm sure will be blessed by this ministry also. So I just appreciate the fact that it's solid, it's truthful, it's honest, and there's no changing God's Word.
And that is the kind of multi-generational impact you have when you support Point of View. So give today. Equip the next generation with the clarity of God's unchanging Word. You can give online at pointofview.net or call us at 1-800-347-5151. That's pointofview.net, and 800-347-5151. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.